Configuring Active Directory Server Roles Part 1. In this nugget, we're first going to formally define what server roles and server features are in the context of Windows Server 2008. This whole idea of roles, frankly, is an extension of what you might remember in late-stage Windows Server 2003. Then we'll turn our attention to Active Directory and all of its various and sundry manifestations. First, we'll look at deploying an Active Directory Lightweight Directory Service, or LDS, server. Next, we'll look at deploying an Active Directory Rights Management Service, or RMS server. Both of these are technologies that were present in Windows Server 2003 R2, but have been significantly overhauled and expanded in Windows Server 2008. What are server roles and features? First, let's define the term role in the context of Windows Server products. A server role can be defined as one or more related components that are intended to fulfill a specific function. For instance, in Windows Server 2008, we have several, not just one, but many, Active Directory roles. We have TCP/IP network service roles like DHCP, DNS. We have Web Server, which maps to Internet Information Services, IIS 7.0, Windows Server Update Services, and so on. The whole purpose of this role motif, everyone, is to reduce the attack surface of our Windows Server 2008 machines. A little bit later in this tutorial series, we'll look at the server core installation, which is really the ultimate method for reducing the attack surface of that machine. And to define our terms, attack surface simply refers to the applications, services, listener ports, and so on that are enabled on that machine. All of those things represent possible points of attack for a particular server box. Now, we had this idea of roles in Windows Server 2003. I'm sure you remember the Manage Your Server wizard. Not many folks I've worked with in industry have been much of a fan of that wizard. It's kind of kludgy, there's no question about it. However, you'll find in Windows Server 2008, if you didn't like roles in 03, you better learn to like them in Server 08. The idea here is least service. We want to enable only those roles on our server that are necessary and leave the other ones not just disabled, but completely uninstalled. Now, whereas a role represents a set of components that really could fully identify a server. In other words, we might have a server called DC1 that is nothing other than an Active Directory Domain Services domain controller. Or we might have an update server, a server running WSUS, and that's pretty much what it does. In contrast to the server role, we have the feature. And a feature is officially defined as a component, an installable component that offers additional functionality to that server. Examples of features in Windows Server 2008 include such things as BitLocker drive encryption, Windows Clustering Service, Connection Manager Administration Kit, or CMAC, and Group Policy. So the idea is you want to have as few roles as possible per server, and then on top of that you can break out or install features as the case may be. There's one third piece that's missing from this whiteboard, and that is what's called the role service. Depending upon the server role that you installed, you may have additional sub-role services that can be installed at that time. And this will make more sense as we go on. And as you see parenthetically down at the bottom, remember the good old Manage Your Server wizard. This whole idea, as I've stated, and probably I'll repeat it again, is just an extension of that idea. It's carried over from Server 03. Configuring roles and features in Windows Server 2008. The application that we use, or should I say the graphical application that we use in Server 08 to configure roles and features, at least primarily, is a tool called Server Manager. Now, Server Manager, the mere mention of which might raise a hackle or bring a smile to your face if you go back as far as Windows NT 4. In Windows NT Server 4.0, the Server Manager tool was used to control things like computer accounts and so forth. Now the Server Manager MMC console, or Microsoft Management Console, is intended to be a one-stop shop for managing roles, features, and other core functionality on a Windows Server box. The command line analog to Server Manager is called Server Manager CMD.exe. This is a command line interface or CLI tool that, again, can be used for installation, configuration, and removal of services, roles, and features. I've been asked by many folks in industry and students and so forth who ask me, Tim, why does Microsoft give you a graphical tool and a command line tool? Most of us are graphical people. Why include the CLI tool? Well, the answer to that, there are many, but one that comes to my mind from my experience is that command line interface tools are especially good for automation and scripting. And we're going to mention it a little bit later in the series. But if you're not familiar with PowerShell, please get familiar. Frankly, going forward in Microsoft server products and technologies, you're not going to be able to ignore it. It's a very powerful command shell or scripting language that Microsoft offered as of a few years ago. Now, as of this recording, in mid to late 2008, PowerShell is already integrated in several of its latest products, including Microsoft Exchange Server 2007. What is Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services, or AD-LDS? Well, friends, AD-LDS is a topic that you're going to see referenced a little bit on your Windows 08 certification exams, but fortunately it, like Active Directory Federation services, aren't something that we need to drill into heavy detail on. We just need to know the overview for your certification success. The reason for that, I think, is that AD-LDS is primarily of interest not to the server administrator like you and I, but to the application developer. What AD-LDS is, friends, is a standalone portable version of Active Directory domain services. Incidentally, in case you haven't picked it up through context yet, ADDS is the Windows Server 2008 version of traditional Active Directory directory services from previous versions of Windows Server. Now you might be thinking, well, I'm familiar with AD-LDS. We had a standalone or portable version of Active Directory in Windows Server 03. It was called Active Directory Application Mode, or ADAM. And if you're thinking that, I'd like to give you a hearty clap on the back and a congratulations, because you're absolutely right. AD-LDS, like many Microsoft technologies, has been spiffed up, spit-shined, rebranded, and slightly refocused in Windows Server 2008. AD-LDS uses what's called the Extensible Storage Engine, or EASY Engine, for its data storage, its file storage. LDS is what's called a hierarchical file-based directory store, and it uses the same protocol, the same TCP/IP protocol that standard Active Directory domain services uses. That's Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, or LDAP. Quiz question. Which TCP port is used traditionally for LDAP communications? Tick, tock. I would hum the Jeopardy theme, but I don't want to traumatize you at all. The answer is port 389, and that's going to come into play when we do our demo very shortly. In a nutshell, what are the benefits? Why would you want to deploy Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services? Well, number one, it's a separate and distinct directory service from Active Directory. I want you to know that LDS can interoperate with Active Directory standard. In other words, you can create an application that stores all of its user data, its group data, application data in a separate directory structure from domain Active Directory. And you can actually tie them together such that LDS, tied in with an application that you've got running in your environment, can use your standard domain users and groups and authenticate them and give them access to your application. You see how that works? LDS is intended for programmers who are already comfortable and familiar with manipulating things like directory partitions. I'm sure you remember the configuration, schema, and application directory partitions in Windows Server 03. Well, LDS uses that same model. Therefore, we have a replication model available in LDS. Essentially, to kind of try to draw this into a single tidy package, LDS gives you a portable version of Active Directory. You can have more than one LDS instance on a single server, and you don't have to muck around with your live forest Active Directory. It's a really good tool. Another benefit is you can use the same tools with AD-LDS that you're used to using with Active Directory domain services. After you create your LDS instance, you use the ASDI Edit graphical tool, or a series of command line tools like LDIF and CSVDIF. I'm sure you remember those from Server 03. And another tool that we had in Server 03, LDP.exe, for interacting directly using LDAP commands. Comparing ADDS and ADLDS. Why don't we spend a couple more minutes wrapping this theoretical information into a tidy little bow? We'll do a demo and then get on with things. You see that I've divided this whiteboard into two sections, with lightweight directory services on the left and domain services on the right. Just as a quick compare and contrast between the two. As I've already said, we can have more than one LDS instant on a non-domain controller machine, whereas with Active Directory domain services, I'm sure you remember this from 03, it's a one-to-one relationship. One installation of Active Directory per one domain controller. DNS is another issue. DNS is not required for LDS. Of course, you remember that it is required for DS. Both technologies make use of multi-master replication and directory partitions, which enable us to control the scope and degree of Active Directory replication. Both technologies use the EZ database. Both technologies use the LDAP schema and rely upon LDAP tools for configuring the instance. Finally, we have group policy and Kerberos authentication. And we see very simply, only domain services supports group policy and only domain services supports Kerberos v5. So you take the good with the bad, my friends. Alrighty then, in this demo, we're going to use Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services, or ADLDS. We are on a Windows Server 2008 Enterprise Edition box named DC Nugget 02. DC Nugget 2 is a member server in the nuggetlab.com domain, and I've just logged on with a domain administrative credential. Now, when you first log into Windows Server 2008, you'll see this Initial Configuration Tasks window. This is the direct analog to manage your server in Windows 03. Now, I would strongly recommend you make use of this. I have to confess I'm a great fan of it myself. If you don't want to see this window at any more logons, just tick Do Not Show This Window at Logon, close the window, and then you're good. But I think it's very helpful. You see it's divided into 3 sections. The first being computer information, where you set your time zone, configure your networking, provide your host name and domain membership. Part 2, we can configure server update status like automatic updates, download and install updates. And finally, under Customize this server, we can add roles, add features, customize remote desktop settings, and configure Windows Firewall. Very cool, huh? When we close the Initial Configuration Tasks console, we'll have the Server Manager appear shortly. In fact, here it is. What we're seeing here, friends, is an example of the Microsoft Management Console version 3. We can verify this by opening up Help, selecting About Microsoft Management Console. And I want to introduce you to some of the differences and similarities from previous versions. First of all, I want to draw your attention to the toolbar, the Show Hide Console tree, and depending upon the MMC console, there may be another button to show or hide the Details pane. Just know that you can click that to toggle your panes on and off. Secondly, when you're at the root node in an MMC console, you'll typically see an overview. For instance, in Server Manager, it tells us what server we're connected to, and then over on the right, we can expand or contract these different summaries. And we have resources and support. We have a summary of installed features, summary of installed roles, and finally a summary that just gives us metadata of that box. Under Server Manager, you'll see we've got roles, features, diagnostics, configuration, and storage. Server Manager is not a customizable MMC console in comparison to one that you might create from scratch. If we expand roles, there's not going to be anything there, as we've said before. So the salient question is, if we're getting off the ground with Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services, how do we install it? Well, we install LDS as a role. So many different ways to do that. You saw from the Initial Configuration Tasks dialog that we just were in, we can do it there. But we can also do it here in Server Manager. We can right-click the Server Manager node and select Add Roles. Alternatively, we can right-click the Roles node and select Add Roles from there as well. This introduces the Add Roles wizard. I'd recommend your first time through these wizards, you read everything that's on the page. You notice that the wizard has an intro page that you can choose to skip for future runs of the wizard if you want to. We'll click Next. Remember that a server role is a deployable element or unit of functionality, and the idea here is we only want to install those roles that we'll actually use on a particular server. You see all of our different Active Directories. We have certificate services, domain services, federation services, LDS, and rights management services. Going on from there, we have App Server, which introduces IIS applications, DHCP, DNS, fax and file services, network policy and remote access, print, terminal services, UDDI service, web server, and Windows deployment services. I want you to know that this list is extensible. That is to say, you can download additional server roles directly from Microsoft. In this case, we're going to choose Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services. And I just want you to see over here that Microsoft has done a bang-up job on documenting their product. This is by far, Windows Server 2008 is by far the most user-friendly and extensible version of the operating system to date. It's extensively documented. We can learn more about server roles by clicking this hyperlink. We can read about LDS by clicking that hyperlink. For now, let's click Next and go on. Again, there's more to learn, there's more to read here. Gives us overview links, understanding, blah, blah, blah. We'll click Next. This is really all we need to get started. We have our summary or our confirmation screen, and let's see if there's anything worthwhile in these informational messages. Yes, there are actually two that are important. This first information piece tells us that after we install LDS, we can bring up one or more instances by launching the Active Directory LDS Setup Wizard from Administrative Tools. So note that. And secondly, it tells us before we can nuke or uninstall the role, we have to use the Program and Features Control Panel item to remove any instances. So if we created 3 LDS instances to support 3 different line of business applications on this server, we would have to uninstall each instance. Once all of those instances were gone, then and only then could we remove this role. Let's click Install and let this thing go. And here we are. We've completed the installation. I want to encourage you, instead of just blowing through these wizards, read, at least your first couple of times through. It tells us here that we have a warning that I've turned off automatic updates, and that's true. I've done that, so that's not that big of a deal. Under our informational message, it tells us again that we go to Administrative Tools and start the AD LDS Setup Wizard. Well, duly noted. We'll click Close, and I'm going to close out of Server Manager, and now let's open up the Start menu, navigate to Administrative Tools, and fire up the Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services Installation Wizard. User Account Control darkens the screen, brings us to the Secure Desktop. By the way, this series that we're doing, the 7649, doesn't cover User Account Control because that's not a focus of the server exams. My colleague and friend James Conrad and I have both taken a big chunk out of the Windows Vista exams, and check the CBT Nuggets website and look at those, because James and I cover UAC in great detail there. Here we know that we want to start this program, so we'll choose Allow to enable it to run. Again, we see wizard after wizard after wizard. This first page is just the welcome. We'll click Next. After the welcome, the first question we have to answer is this the first instance of an ADLDS, or are we creating a replica of an existing instance? Remember, your line of business application may be installed in multiple locations in multiple cities or countries or wherever, and you may want to keep data in one server's instance in sync with its replication partners. Since we haven't created an LDS instance, we'll choose Unique and then choose Next. We're asked to give a name to this instance. I'm going to call this Nugget Lab App. And it tells us down below as we type that that the service display name will be what we've typed. The AD-LDS service name is Atom, interestingly enough. Remember Active Directory application mode from Server 03, underscore Nugget Lab app. We'll click Next. Now, port assignment is important. As I quizzed you before, LDAP uses TCP 389, and when LDAP is secured with Secure Sockets Layer, or SSL, it uses 636. But as this text tells us, if we're going to use Active Directory domain services, we can't use 389 for our LDS instance because it's going to conflict. So we want to make sure to choose a unique LDAP port number and also a unique SSL port number. I think that's best practice anyway. So I'm just prepending a 6 to the 389 and the 636. You'll have to remember those port numbers because that's how we're going to connect to the LDS instance. Let's click Next. The next question we have to answer is whether we want to create an application directory partition for this instance. We could choose either no or yes. The reason why we would want to create a partition is to determine what kind of scope we have for our replication. Do we want to replicate the entire instance among multiple servers that are hosting the instance? Or, if this is going to become a ginormous data store, we may want to use application directory partitions to cut down on the amount of data that's replicated. Now you notice that we're using LDAP syntax here, and it tells us that we can use any distinguished name, or DN, that does not already exist in this instance. So I'm going to choose common name, or CN, of partition 1, comma, DC is domain component, and Woodgrove, nope, that's what they used for their example. We used Nugget Lab app. There we go. Next, just like we did when we run DC Promo in Windows Server 03 to install traditional Active Directory, we're asked where in the file system we want to store our data files. Note the default path: Program Files, Microsoft Atom, Instance Name, Data. Of course, security and service accounts are of critical importance. We can either rely upon the operating system using network service, or we can use a dedicated account. I'm going to use my Trainer Domain Administrator account. We're told that the selected account does not have permission to run as a service. Do you want AD-LDS to add this permission to the account? I'm going to click Yes. Best practice is you always want to use a dedicated domain account for your service accounts, not just for LDS, but for any Windows Server program, like SharePoint Server, SQL Server, and so on. Now, frankly, you don't want to use an account that folks are going to log on with. Trainer here needs to be a dedicated service account and not an account that Joe user or Jane user uses. Next, we specify who can administer this LDS instance. It defaults to the currently logged on user, which is my Trainer account. Alternatively, we can select a domain user or group who will have administrative privileges. Of course, if we have more than one person who needs to administer the instance, we'll want to choose this account and bring in an Active Directory group. Next. Now you might remember from Windows Server 2003 Active Directory stuff that the LDAP database that Active Directory uses, the schema in particular, is divided into what are called classes and attributes. An example of a class would be a user. An attribute would be first name, email address, group membership, logon hours, etc. So what we're doing here is we're easing our administrative and setup burden by choosing to import one or more LDIF files that give us some pre-done classes and attributes from Active Directory. I'm going to just choose user here. msuser.ldef gives us our LDS user class and related classes. So we'd be able to easily manage users and groups and that kind of stuff. We'll click Next. Ready to install. Here's our summary screen. We'll click Next to continue. So there you have it. We've completed the installation of a single LDS instance. To finish this demo out, let's just go in and I'll show you how to manage the instance really quickly. Let's complete the wizard and bring back Server Manager. Now that we've added an additional role, we see under the Roles node Active Directory Lightweight Directory Services. The summary page here gives us a filtered run of any events in the event logs that pertain to this service. That's very helpful, isn't it? Scroll down a little bit, System Services. This gives us a filtered list of any background services that depend upon Lightweight Directory Services and vice versa. And finally, where we need to be right now is under Advanced Tools. We have one-click access to launch the Setup Wizard if we want to bring up another instance, ADSI Edit to give us query, view, and edit capabilities to the directory. And then what we'll do now is open up the ldp.exe tool. This has been around for a little while. It's not the easiest program in the world to use, that's for darn sure. To make an initial connection, we'll open the Connection menu and select Connect. Server name is DCNugget02. We have to make sure to put the correct port in there. Remember, it's not 389, but I made it 6389 in my case. We'll click OK. Looks like we've made our initial connection. So far, so good. Now this is showing under the hood EKG kind of stuff at what's going on in that LDS instance. If we open up Connection, we can drill into the instance by binding. So we'll choose Bind from the Connection menu, and the default bind type is the currently logged on user. But you can also do credential binds with another set of credentials, simple bind, or advanced. And then encrypt traffic after bind is selected by default. So we'll click OK. Tells us in the status that we've now been successfully authenticated as trainer and we're ready to rock and roll. You see here in this admittedly cumbersome text, like I told you before, LDS is largely an application developer thing as opposed to a server administrator thing. We can see our naming contexts or our directory partitions. If we wanted to add a new directory partition in this instance of LDS or delete one, we would open up Browse, Add Child, Delete, Modify, and so on. If we choose Add Child, we would put in a new distinguished name or DN, add some additional attributes and values, click Run, and that would create an additional application directory partition. So much for LDAP. Let's close this out by opening the Connection menu and selecting Exit. Second and final tool I want to show you really quick is under Advanced Tools, ADSI Edit. We use this tool to navigate the Active Directory domain services and LDS schema. And as this instructional text tells us, we can view, modify, create, and delete any object in the directory service. Let's dip into ADSI Edit, shall we? To make a connection, we'll right-click the ADSI Edit node and select Connect to. The name for this connection I'm going to choose as the name of our instance, Nugget Lab App. Next, we choose our connection point. We'll choose Select or Type a distinguished name, and you might remember the application partition we initially created was called Partition 1. Finally, under Computer, we can choose Select or Type or Default. We don't want default here because we used an alternate port, you might remember. So we're on DC Nugget 02, and we used 6389 as our port number. Let's click OK. Alright, so we've made our connection to that instance. Now that we're in the instance, we can do things like creating organizational units, creating user and group accounts, and granting or denying those user or group accounts access to resources within the application we've created that depends upon this LDS instance. The downside, everybody, is that it's really kludgy. I think you see by now it's nowhere near as easy as what we do with ADDS with Active Directory users and computers. Wouldn't you agree? So what you'll see here is our default naming context that we created during the installation. It shows up as a container in the Details node. Remember before I told you that the MMC3 enables us to collapse panes that we don't want to see. So I'll collapse the Details or Actions pane. Next, we can right-click the container here. Whoops. We'll go to New, Object, and to create an object in Lightweight Directory Services is as easy as running through this Create Object wizard. We can use Container to create an OU, Group to create a group, User to create a user. We're going to create a container first, and we'll just call this Users. We can add additional attributes if we want to. I'll click Finish for now, though. Let's finish this out by creating a simple user, shall we? In the ADSI Edit console, We can expand the application, expand the default naming context, actually we'll select it, and we can see our users container that we just finished creating. So to add a user account to this OU, we can right-click it, go to New, Object, and in this case we'll select User from the class list, click Next, and give the user a name. I will call this user Susan W. Now we can go into more attributes if we want to and add in additional attribute data for that user. Right now though, I'll just click Finish and go from there. Now if we double-click and enter the user's container, we'll see our Susan W. user. We can right-click to reset her password. We can delete, move, rename, or visit Properties to have direct access to the attributes that are associated with her account. So there ends the demo. I hope that you feel better about LDS than you did prior to watching these nuggets. What is Active Directory Rights Management Services? ADRMS, as it's sometimes called, is an information management technology that again came around in late-stage Windows Server 03. Primarily I'm thinking about the R2 update, but that is still alive and well, and much more than that, in Windows Server 2008. The upshot here, friends, is that RMS is used to protect intellectual property and also to help companies stay into compliance with various federal, state, and local mandates. Think of things like HIPAA for those businesses that are in the medical industry, or think of Sarbanes-Oxley or SOX for businesses that have accounting departments, of which I would think any business would. So the idea is incumbent upon us as systems administrators to figure out a way to protect our files, to protect our intellectual property, and to limit what users can do with those documents. It's one thing to use shared folder and NTFS permissions, but as you know, if a user has read permission on a file, then there's nothing to prevent him or her from printing that file and doing other things that we may not want that user to do with the file. RMS represents the next step in information management technology. We're going to see a lot more of it in the coming months and years. And if you're using SharePoint Server at all, SharePoint's a great example of another Microsoft technology that can plug into Windows Server 2008 RMS. So speaking of requirements, RMS requires that your applications, your client-side applications, support RMS. In particular, it's called IRM. Now, you'd think that I'm going nuts with the TLAs here, don't you? TLA is a three-letter acronym, by the way. But IRM stands for, as I think I just said, Information Rights Management. And in order for this to work, this client-server technology to work, we have to have a server, at least one, running RMS that's hosting those file resources, and any client-side applications that will access those files needs to be IRM aware. Now, of course, the Microsoft Office 2007 System Suite is fully IRM aware, as is Office 2003. And of course, if you've obviously done Microsoft exams because you're upgrading your MCSE to MCITP, so you know that you won't see references to third-party products on Microsoft exams. When you go into that testing room, Microsoft technologies are all there is in the world. Requirements for ADRMS. In order to get ADRMS off the ground in your Windows Server 2003 environment, you first of all, obviously, have to install the RMS role on at least one Windows 08 box. In addition, you have to have SQL Server available, some variety or flavor, because as it happens, RMS stores much of its metadata in SQL Server database. We also need to have access to an Active Directory Directory Services, or ADDS, domain controller for authentication, and our applications have to be RMS aware, as I've already said. Now you might be wondering, how is authentication and authorization taking place? As you'll see in the demo, digital certificates and transmitted licenses are used for both authentication and authorization. What we're seeing here, friends, is a trend toward something that Cisco has been a huge proponent of for many years, and Microsoft is finally catching up, and that is AAA. No, I'm not talking about the American Automobile Association either. I'm talking about the first A representing authentication. Are you who you say you are? The second A is authorization. All right, you've been authenticated. Now, what are the limits of your privilege to this file, print, or application resource? And finally, the third A stands for accounting. In other words, we're concerned with audit trails, making sure we can prove what happened to our file system resources. In this demo, we're going to take a look at Active Directory Rights Management Services, or ADRMS. I'm on a domain controller named DCNugget01 in the nuggetlab.com domain. How can I tell that really quickly in Server 08? Well, I can open the Start menu, right-click the computer entry, select Properties. This is a shortcut method for bringing up the System Control Panel item. We see that I'm running Windows Server Standard Edition Service Pack 1. All well and good. Now, I've done quite a bit of homework in the background to set the stage for us. Number one, I've gone into Internet Information Services. Actually, I've installed Internet Information Services as a role service. And as you see here, this is, by the way, IIS 7 if you haven't seen it before. It's been given a cosmetic overhaul and actually a feature overhaul from what you remember in Windows Server 03 for sure. And what I've done here is installed a digital certificate. I've actually installed a Active Directory Certificate Services service on this machine, and the Certificate Services has issued this IIS instance a domain certificate. So I've done that in the background. Remember that behind the scenes, RMS relies upon IIS and digital certificates to keep things straight. Let's bring Server Manager up, and as you see, or as I've promised, I've done quite a bit of homework. I've installed the Certificate Services role. I also have the Web Server IIS role, and it brought along the File Services role for the ride as well. Quite a bit going on. Therefore, since we've set the stage for ADRMS by installing Certificate Services and getting IIS all linked up with a digital certificate, our next step is to right-click the Roles node in Server Manager and select Add Roles. We'll click Next past the welcome screen, and we'll select from the list Active Directory Rights Management Services. Remember I told you that some server roles have one or more role services and perhaps even features that you can install optionally, or in some cases it's mandatory in order to finish that role configuration. Well, as you see in this case, RMS involves quite a few role services and feature requirements. We have to have IIS, .NET environment, message queuing, and so on. So the only choice we have, frankly, is to add the required role services to the queue and move on. It looks like Active Directory Rights Management Server does have one optional role service, and that's Identity Federation support. We're going to learn about Active Directory Federation services in the next nugget. I want you to see also, I'm sure you've noticed, that as we step through the pages in this wizard, this navigation bar down on the left lets us know how far through the wizard we are. You'll also note that you can go backwards and forward through the wizard pages by hovering your mouse over a step and giving it a click. Now, just like we saw with LDS, is this going to be a new instance of the service, or are we joining an existing? Cluster refers to a unified RMS instance that either exists on a single server in your domain, or a single RMS cluster might identify multiple servers. Well, in this case, this is the first and only RMS server, so I'm going to create a new ADRMS cluster. Remember I mentioned that SQL Server is used on the back end for data storage. You can choose either the Windows Internal Database, which is a very stripped-down, limited version of SQL Server, or if you actually have an instance of SQL Server 2005 or 2008 on your network, you can point to that. I don't, so I'm going to use the Windows Internal Database. Next, we specify our service account. We can click Specify to identify that account. I'm going to use Trainer and supply the password. Click Next. Remember that digital certificates are used for RMS validation. Digital certificates also bring up the notion of public key infrastructure and cryptography. This page asks us where we want to store the cluster key. This is the master encryption key that's used to sign certificates and licenses that are issued by the cluster. You can either let RMS handle that key storage, or you can use a separate cryptographic service provider, or CSP. Here I'll select the default option just for simplicity's sake. We also want to protect that cluster key with a very strong password, so I'll put that in now and I'll confirm. It also tells us that we want to preserve this password by backing it up. We'll click Next to continue. It tells us that the RMS is hosted on an IIS virtual directory. Which website do we want to use? We'll want to go into IIS Manager 7 and make sure to have our sites and application pools pre-staged. You'll remember from Server 03 that IIS does give you a default website. I'm not using the site for any other purpose here, so I'll leave the default alone and click Next. It asks us next, are we going to choose SSL or an unencrypted connection? Of course, SSL is a best practice. Let's go down to internal address and put in the fully qualified domain name of our server, dcnugget01.nuggetlab.com. 443 is the default secure sockets layer port. We'll choose validate and then next. Since we're using SSL, we have to choose a certificate. I'm going to choose the certificate that I created a little bit earlier. Note that we could also create a self-signed certificate or choose a certificate for SSL encryption later. Like I said, I've created a certificate from an enterprise root certification authority I've defined behind the scenes. What is the licensor, or the originating certificate name? It's going to be the server name in my case. Do we want to register the service connection point now, or SCP as it's sometimes called, or do we want to do it later? Well, I definitely want to bring the SCP up now. It tells us that the SCP provides our users with intranet URLs for the ADRMS cluster. This basically enables your users transparent access to the server. They don't have to know much about what you're doing with RMS on the back end. Finally, we get into IIS configuration. What role services, optional, do we want to install in IIS? I'll leave this alone right now. You notice that a lot of this is grayed out because it's already been installed. We'll click Next. Finally, we're at confirmation. This is quite an obstacle course, isn't it? Let's click Install and get this thing off the ground. It's probably going to take a little while to get through all of these operations. Cool. We've completed successfully. It does tell us here that before we administer ADRMS on this server, we have to log off and log on again. So I'll go ahead and do that and continue the movie once I've logged back on. And to finish this demo up and wrap it up into a tidy little bow, here in Server Manager you see we have an Active Directory Rights Management Services node. Underneath there we have any RMS servers that are in this cluster, and then underneath there you have several subnodes that for the purposes of the 7649 exam we don't need to be concerned with. To actually set permissions using rights management, first of all you have to share out a folder to your network. The root of my C drive, I've created a folder called private. If I right-click and select share, I've already got it shared, so I'll select change sharing permissions, and you'll see I've set this for domain users as contributor permission levels. You see that file sharing uses a different interface than it did with Windows Server 2003. We have this role-based permission, reader, contributor, or co-owner. So that's fine. That'll get the documents up and out on the network. The very final thing is to open up one of those documents in an IRM RMS compatible application. Of course, Word 2007 is one of those applications. We'll open the Office button, come down to Prepare, over to Restrict Permission, and then fire up Restricted Access. I have a minor issue with my certificate. I'll click Yes to proceed anyway. We're asked to authenticate, and you can customize who can just read the document, who's allowed to save the document, who's allowed to print the document, and so forth. So that's rights management services in a nutshell. It's definitely not the easiest technology in the world to get up and running, but you certainly have more than enough information at this point to answer any question you'll see on the certification exam on this subject. Let's recap what we've learned in the last 45 minutes or so. This nugget was called Configuring Active Directory Server Roles Part 1 of 2. By now I hope that you're very comfortable with the concept of the server role and the role service, and how they really go a long way to improve the security of a Windows Server 2008 machine. We didn't spend a lot of time directly talking about features. Features are optional subcomponents that add functionality to a server. We'll be working with those more in future nuggets. Actually, we're going to be installing and removing roles and features pretty much over the course of the entire series. We spent the lion's share of this nugget on deploying and configuring 2 flavors of Active Directory. By now, I hope you're more comfortable with Lightweight Directory Services, or LDS, how we can use it to create a portable directory store for use with our line of business applications. And we looked at Rights Management Services, or RMS, that provides an extensible way to protect our intellectual property against folks printing stuff we don't want them to print, saving stuff we don't want them to save. I hope that this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.